Alrighty, let's get going. I'm Mike Jones. I'm a standards architect at Microsoft, as is my colleague Pieter Kasselman on the side, that will be doing this fun tag team storytelling about some work we've been doing to secure the identity ecosystem. So bad actors are stealing your OAuth tokens, and it matters because they're getting control of your information. The OAuth DPoP work, the demonstration of proof of possession, is what we're doing about it. So this is your cast of characters. So in the next 25 minutes, I'll talk with you about token theft being real, about how proof of possession is going to come to the rescue, and in fact already is. I'll talk a little bit about the long, strange trip it's been, and where we have arrived at today, and what the future looks like. And then Pieter will talk about some attacks that we've recently dealt with in the spec that we believe takes us to spec complete. So token theft is real. This is a slide that Alex Weinert, who's the head of identity protection at Microsoft, was gracious enough to loan to us. Over a recent 6-month period, there were over 150,000 token thefts detected by our protection software. These were all enterprise accounts. These were not personal accounts. There's also token theft there, but just so you know what you're looking at. During that same period, there were about 1.7 million malware detections. And these are somewhat correlated. According to Alex, a lot of the token theft is happening via malware. But, and I didn't even realize this till a few months ago, it's not just people you think of as bad actors that are going to steal your tokens. Sometimes the person stealing the token is the legitimate user. Imagine an employee of a bank who's using a token in an audited environment. Well, if they can steal the token and put it in an unaudited environment, they might be able to do things too. So there's a lot of kinds of token theft, and we're going to try to deal with all of it. So a lot of you know this, but just as a refresher, OAuth tokens are typically bearer tokens. They're like cash. If you have them, you can use them. Now, they're easy to generate, easy to use. It's the predominant pattern, but it has this property that if you steal it, you can use it. Whereas we're developing what we call proof of possession tokens, which are a safer alternative. Just like I used the cash analogy, here I'll use the driver's license analogy. This is a token that's issued to a particular person, and you could steal it, but Pieter probably couldn't use this because it doesn't look a lot like Pieter. It's bound to this person. And so that's what we're trying to do in the online world, is bind tokens to you or software acting on your behalf so that even if it's stolen, it can't be reused on your behalf. So, I work on standards, as does Pieter and some of the other people in the room. There is one OAuth 2 token standard to date after all of this time. That finished in October 2012, nearly a decade ago. It is the bearer token standard. There are no other approved OAuth token standards. We are trying to change that right now. So now I'll talk about how proof of possession comes to the rescue. So first, what is proof of possession? Proof of possession, in this case, demonstrates that you possess cryptographic material when performing an operation, just like that lady possessed her own photograph when using her driver's license. How does this work? Well, typically you do it in conjunction with signing a piece of data that's specific to the transaction with that proof of possession key. And why? Well, we want to prevent the use of stolen tokens. You can still steal them, you just can't use them, which is okay. So there's a lot of different names for what we call proof of possession. In the SAML world, it's often known as holder of key. There's sender-constrained tokens, key-constrained tokens, certificate-bound tokens, key-bound tokens, key confirmation, and for extra credit, I want any of you with another name to come up and tell me after the talk. So we've been on quite a journey trying to get to an OAuth to proof of possession token standard. Well, there is one proof of possession standard that's active in the industry. It's the SAML holder of key assertion profile. Works well, it's not OAuth. OAuth 1 used proof of possession, but the POP wasn't that hard, but people thought the message signing was too hard, and the industry kind of walked away from it a little over a decade ago. At that time, again, about a dozen years ago, there was an OAuth 2 Mac draft that the original authors of OAuth 2 did. Again, that was considered too complicated and the working group abandoned it. There was an HTTP 2 signing draft for OAuth. The working group abandoned it. There is a TLS token binding draft, and that can be used and is used in production. That does do proof of possession. So I kind of told a fib earlier, that is an RFC. But client certs are notoriously hard to use on the open internet. In a small constrained, or even a big constrained environment, like a banking environment, where you can pre-issue the certs, it can work out. But it's not good on the open internet. Which brings us to our current topic, the OAuth DPoP work. So what is DPoP? DPoP is demonstrating proof of possession at the application layer. And it's a pragmatic application level proof of possession mechanism for OAuth 2 access and refresh tokens. Now, again, I saw my friend and photographer, Brian Campbell, do a really good, detailed presentation. Stand up, Brian. He gets credit for a lot of the next sequence of slides. I'm not bashful. He did better slides than I was going to do. I asked if I could borrow some of his slides with attribution, and he kindly let me. So the inspiration for the name came from a poster that Brian saw riding in the S-Bahn in Stuttgart in 2019 for the OAuth security workshop, where we came up with this whole idea. So how does this work? I'll assume you know what JOTs are, JSON Web Tokens, a piece of signed data with claims. We have a special kind of JOT we call a DPoP proof, which is the signing with the proof of possession key of the key material proving that you have the key and therefore are the eligible user of the issued token. Well, there's a bunch of mechanics to make this work. So you have this thing called the DPoP proof, which we generate and sign with the key, and you include it in a bunch of the OAuth flows as an additional parameter. In this case, it's a HTTP header, a new one called DPoP, we're so clever, that has this DPoP JOT in it. So what's in a DPoP JOT? You know, these days you want to type everything so that it can't be repurposed. So we have a type DPoP plus JOT. We have an algorithm. Those are header parameters. Then we have a key type. We have the key itself, the public key corresponding to the private key, and some stuff that we're signing, including the HTTP method, the HTM parameter, and the HTTP URL. There's an issued at, an access token hash. I mean, all cryptographic goodness, which I'm not about to try to explain to you in 12 minutes. It is the proof of possession public key. And so you use these things. There's an access token request. Guess what? There's a DPoP header in it. There's an access token response. And you'll see that the token, actually, oh, this is a mixed up. Oh, there's the access token, there's the refresh token, and they're bound to the proof of possession key. A refresh token request, again, looks a lot like the access token request. It has a DPoP proof in it. And we are using the DPoP token type. Again, another DPoP proof in the protected resource request. So we're reusing the same mechanism over and over. That's a good thing. Now, supposing you make a request and you didn't know you needed a DPoP proof. Well, the protocol has a way of helping you. There's this thing in HTTP called the www authentication header, or a response, where you can respond and say, oh, I wanted you to use DPoP, and by the way, you could use either of those algorithms. Similarly, if you make a protected resource request and you didn't have the DPoP proof or you didn't have the right one, it can tell you. So that's all DPoP was for a long time. In the last 9 months or something, we've added 2 things, which Pieter will shortly talk about why we added them. One is having the ability to have a nonce in the proof. Well, what do we use nonces for in protocols? It's to prove liveness or to prove freshness. So the server, in this case, at any time, can say, I want you to include this nonce in your DPoP proof. And if you don't sign it with the server-provided nonce, then the server knows, oh, this is not the droid you're looking for. You know, unsurprisingly, we have metadata. Good OAuth deployments do, both client metadata and server metadata. Here, now, the other new feature we added was the ability to end-to-end bind the entire flow to the DPoP key. Originally, all of this only operated on the token endpoint, but you are doing an initial exchange at the authorization endpoint on the front channel. So we added an option, the DPoP JWK thumbprint, to give a thumbprint of the key and bind that at the initial request time to the rest of the flows. Again, I'm not going to try to explain all the mechanics in the time we have here. It's in the spec. But the key point is the first bullet, that this lets every phase of the OAuth request, from the initial authorization request through the resource response, be bound to the same client DPoP key. So where are we? We are finally at the place where we're progressing very close to being an RFC. We have completed working group last call, and Rafat, who may be in the room, has written a Shepherd review that Brian and I and some of the other authors have to finish responding to. After that, there'll be IASG review, and if that goes well, it goes to the RFC editor, and then it comes out the RFC machine at the other end. Implementations are appearing, which is great. I mean, there are potential challenges ahead, that adoption of new standards is never a certainty. On the other hand, there's a lot of demand for this. Why? Because token theft is real. I can say how much demand there is inside Microsoft, but there's a lot of demand in other high-value services. So for instance, Amazon Web Services doesn't let you do an access token request without it being token bound. Well, it's not this protocol, it's an Amazon protocol, but they weren't going to expose their APIs without this. you know, some people are worried public key cryptography takes a little while. It does. Some things are optional. I think profiles will choose the parts that they need. We've got a lot of good data that, for instance, the FAPI2 work in the OpenID Foundation has endorsed this as a means of sender constraining their access token, and there's interest from a lot of parties and applications. So I think we're on the verge of a standard. And I do have to speak to this auspicious photograph, which again, Brian was in the Vienna U-Bahn the day that working group last call was requested. And what does he find? Another DPoP sign on the wall. And with that, I will turn it over to my friend Pieter.
Thank you, Mike. Oh, we're live. My name is Pieter Kasselman. I have the privilege of working with Mike and many other people at Microsoft on standards, and also get to collaborate with this wonderful community. This is my first Identiverse, so I'm really psyched to be here, and also just a little bit nervous. Mike,
No, go ahead.
So I'm going to talk about two new attacks that we found in the process of working through the DPoP standard, and also how DPoP has been updated to actually thwart them and prevent them from happening. The first one is a pre-computation, DPoP proof pre-computation attack. And I'll explain a little bit more about how that one works. And then the other one is the authorization code binding or rebinding attack. And I'll also explain how the attack works and how DPoP mitigates them. So with that, first one, I'm going to talk a little bit about the proof pre-computation attack. Now, to explain this, I think very quickly, just DPoP at a glance. As Mike already explained, it's a pretty simple protocol, right? The client sends the public key and the proof of possession proof, the DPoP proof, to the IDP. The IDP binds it to the cryptographic keys to the tokens and sends back the access and refresh token. The client can now generate fresh tokens whenever it needs to interact with the resource provider. They present the tokens, the resource provider validates it, and sends it back. It's pretty easy, easy peasy, right? And as a result, if somebody steals the token, they really shouldn't be able to do much with this. So let's talk for a moment about the DPoP pre-computation attack. So in this attack, one of the things that you can do with DPoP, if you know that you're going to need tokens in 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes, or with some interval, you can actually pre-compute them. Because it's computationally intensive. So you can keep them, have a bag of DPoP proofs ready to use whenever you need to. So the protocol actually sort of executes, it starts as before, the tokens get bound, and the client can then generate these tokens or pre-compute them. But at this point, our friendly attacker can intervene. And as Mike pointed out, malware is a pretty common way in which tokens get stolen. And if you can steal the token, you can steal the DPoP proof. So you can deploy the malware, you can steal the tokens, but you can also pre-compute potentially. So that is another risk. So if they're not pre-computed, you can actually deploy the malware and pre-compute some of these proofs with selected IAT values. IAT is the parameter that you use to specify the moment in time when you want the proof to be valid. And they get exfiltrated and they get moved off box. At this point, the attacker waits. And they can wait for an opportune moment, right? There's going to be a moment when they know that the system is a little bit more vulnerable. Maybe there's some maintenance happening. Maybe there's high volumes in traffic, so the attack can be hidden. There might be any number of reasons why they may want to wait with that attack. And they present it at their convenience, both the pre-computed proof and the exfiltrated token. The resource provider, of course, verify the proof, and they check the IAT, and lo and behold, it's valid, and access is granted. So what can we do to stop this? This is where the server nonce come in. Nonces are a technique that's fairly commonly used in protocol design. It's a way to force freshness. And actually deployed with DPoP, it actually stops this attack of exfiltrating pre-computed DPoP proofs. So the client can present, again, the binding happens, the constraint tokens are issued, the client may generate the tokens, and our attacker deploys their malware. They pre-compute the proofs and exfiltrate the tokens. They wait cunningly, and at the right moment present the proof. But now the resource provider says, well, there's no server-supplied nonce. I actually want to make sure that you are in control of the key right now. And it sends back a challenge, and it says, sorry, here's the server-supplied nonce. Please sign this so that I know that you're still in possession of the key. Of course, at this point, the attacker can't generate the proof because they don't have the key, and they can't use the stolen token, right? So this proof pre-computation attack is now prevented and foiled. So pretty simple mechanism, very effective, and an extra layer and an optional capability within DPoP. The next attack that I'm going to talk about very briefly is the authorization code rebinding attack. It's a mouthful, so Pieter, what are you talking about? So, here we go. So just remember, this was the basic flow, right? However, to understand this attack, you actually have to take 3 steps back. So it turns out, when you send the authorization request initially in the authorization code grant flow, the identity provider will authenticate the user and issue an authorization code, which is then sent back to the client. The client then sends the authorization code, the DPoP proof, and the public key. They get bound. They're sent back. The client can generate fresh proofs. They can present it when needed. The relying party can validate them, maybe do a server nonce challenge if they need to, and resource to the access token is granted. And there's one more wrinkle. We draw these lines as if they're straight lines, right? We love engineers, right? It's like, oh, box 1, box 2, draw a straight line. But the reality in the middle of all of this, there is all sorts of break and inspect proxies, there's VPNs, there's logs on the client. And what tends to happen is that access codes and other important artifacts end up in these log files. And that is an attack point that we have observed in the real world. And so if you can exfiltrate the log file that has these important artifacts, you can actually get really creative about the sort of attacks that you start executing. And one of those is the authorization code rebinding attack. There's a couple of versions of this attack. I'm going to explain the most simple one. The good news is the mitigation actually solves for all of them. So first, the authorization request. It's, again, the authorization code get issued, sent back. But at this point, the attacker intervenes. And they obtain the log file with the authorization code, which they then, the next step, they go and they generate their own DPoP proof and their own DPoP key. So having your own DPoP key as the attacker means you get to generate DPoP proofs, and you can present that along with the authorization code to the identity provider. Now, at this point, the identity provider cannot distinguish between the client and the attacker, and so they bind the keys. And now, you as the attacker have access to sender-constrained access tokens and a DPoP key that you can use with a relying party. And let's see, there we go. They create their fresh proofs, they present it, and they get access. Okay. And again, this is a pattern that we like the exfiltration of log files and the exploitation of the artifacts in there is something we have observed in the wild as well. Now, how do we protect against this? Now, the good news is protecting against this turned out to be really, really easy. When the authorization request is sent, there's an extra parameter, the DPoP JWK thumbprint. The identity provider takes that and they authenticate the user, they issue the authorization code, and at this point, they bind it to the DPoP public key, and they send back the artifacts. Now they exfiltrate, when the attacker exfiltrates from the log file, the attacker can generate their own proofs, their own keys. They can request for the binding, but at this point, the IDP can say, sorry, you're presenting me with a new key that I haven't seen before, right? And they refuse to issue any tokens. So the attack is foiled, right, and then rejected. And essentially, a fairly simple mitigation that's now part of the DPoP standard. And please use this mitigation as well. So, a call to action. Please protect yourself from token theft with DPoP. It's real, as Mike talked about it. There are many, many ways in which they do get exfiltrated, some of them counterintuitive sometimes, as I've sort of explained with some of the attacks we see. But my request for everybody in this room, please start using DPoP or other token binding approaches that you have. Let's turn bearer tokens into something of the past. And then, with that, at the end. Thank you.